Good morning to all. Sergeants, could you please start the stream and the recordings?
Recording in progress.
Stream has been confirmed. Good morning. Welcome to New York City Council's hybrid committee hearing on rules, privileges, and elections. Everyone, please turn on your video at this time. Silence all electronic devices. All written testimony can be submitted to testimony@council.nyc.gov. Again, that is testimony@council.nyc.gov. Thank you. Chair Powers, we're ready to begin.
Good morning, and welcome to the Committee on Rules, Privileges, and Elections. My name is Keith Powers. I am the chair of this committee. Before we begin the hearing this morning, I'd like to introduce the council members of this committee who have joined us here today. We're joined by Councilmember Justin Brannan virtually, Councilmember Gail Brewer, Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers virtually, Councilmember Crystal Hudson, Councilmember Parina Sanchez, and we may be joined by others shortly. I'd like to also, before we begin, acknowledge the Rules Committee Counsel, Lance Pallavi, and the staff members of the Council's investigative unit, Chuck Davis, the Chief Compliance Officer, and investigators Alicia Vassell and Ramses Budin, who I think are here with us today as well. Today, the Rules Committee will be considering the nominations of two individuals, Georgia Pestana and Ifeoma Ike, to the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board. Ms. Pestana has been nominated by the City Controller. Ms. Ike has been nominated by our Public Advocate. For background, the Conflicts of Interest Board is the entity that serves to provide clear guidance to public employees regarding the conflict of interest laws codified in the New York City Charter's Chapter 68, which lays out the type of conduct prohibited by public servants. The board is tasked with achieving this goal through training, education, and the issuance and publication of advisory opinions relating to conduct that may violate the city's conflict of interest law. We're also joined, of course, here by our Public Advocate, Jemani Williams, as well. The board also adopts rules to implement and interpret the provisions of the conflict of interest laws. It reviews and makes decisions on alleged conflict violations and has the power to impose fines up to $25,000 per violation and suspension or dismissal of the city employee when deemed appropriate. The board also collects and reviews financial disclosure reports. The board consists of 5 members who are appointed by the mayor with the advice and consent of the city council, as today's hearing proves. The mayor must also designate one of these members to serve as the chair of the board. The charter states that these members should be chosen for their independence, integrity, civic commitment, and high ethical standards. Board members serve a 6-year term and are prohibited to serving no more than 2 consecutive 6-year terms pursuant to New York City Charter Section 2602C. These board members are mandated to meet at least once per month and are prohibited from holding public office, seeking election to any public office, being a public employee in any jurisdiction, holding any political party office, or appearing as a lobbyist before the city pursuant to Charter Section 2602B. Board members are entitled to receive compensation in the amount of $250 for each calendar day that they perform work for the board, and the chair is entitled to receive 275 days per day of service. And perhaps most notably and famously, we are very cognizant of the fantastic Twitter account of the Conflict of Interest Boards as well. And if you aren't, I highly recommend it. Today we have 2 candidates that are here before us. We're going to hear from them in order. The first one is Georgia Pestana, who's a resident of Manhattan. We like that. A candidate for appointment by the controller to the Conflicts of Interest Board. If she receives the advice and consent of this council, she'll serve a 6-year term that begins on April 1st, 2022 and expires on March 31st, 2028. Following her, we'll hear from Ifeoma Ike, a resident of Brooklyn and a candidate for appointment by the Public Advocate to the Conflict of Interest Board. If she receives the advice and consent of the City Council, she will serve a 6-year term that begins on April 1st, 2022, and expires on March 31st, 2022. Before we get started, we're going to start with Ms. Pestana. We're going to ask you to raise your hand and be sworn in by our counsel, and then we'll ask you and invite you to do an opening statement.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Great, thank you. If we would like, can make an opening statement here today before we go into questions.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Powers and distinguished members of the Rules, Privileges, and Elections Committee. It is my pleasure to come before you to introduce myself to a few of you and say hello again to others and answer your questions relating to my nomination by the Comptroller for appointment to the New York City Conflicts of Interest Board. I also want to thank Comptroller Brad Lander for nominating me to this important role. I am honored by this opportunity. As I'm sure you know, I was most recently the city's corporation counsel and worked as a lawyer for the city of New York for more than 34 years before I retired at the end of February. During that time, I had many interactions with the COIB. In addition, sorry. Is this better?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. In addition to filing annual financial disclosure statements and attending trainings, I also had occasion to telephone their attorney of the day to ask random questions that arose in litigation or other legal matters when I was chief of the Labor and Employment Law Division. I also called a few times over the years to report what I thought might be violations of the Conflicts of Interest law. Regardless of the reason for my call, I was always impressed by the responsiveness and dedication of everyone I encountered. Staff asked thoughtful questions and were responsive to the issues that I raised or referred me to the general counsel or the executive director if the matter I raised warranted that level of attention. My interactions with board members occurred when the law department was representing the COIB in litigation or on occasions when we thought an affidavit or other submission by the COIB would be helpful in litigation, even though the COIB was not a party. Over several administrations, board members displayed a profound comprehension of the Conflicts of Interest law, the rationales for its requirements and prohibitions, and a strong commitment to government ethics. But even strong institutions can be improved. The Council's 2019 Charter Revision Commission recognized that the independence of the board, both actual and perceived, would be strengthened by the replacement of 2 board members appointed by the mayor, with board members appointed by 2 other citywide elected officials, the Comptroller and the Public Advocate, with all 5 members of the board subject to confirmation by the City Council. Along with amendments to Chapter 68 that the Council enacted in 2018, which narrowed the use of advisory opinions and required the COIB to codify interpretations of the law and standards it applied over the last 30 years, changes have improved not only the operations of the COIB and facilitated access to information, but should also crystallize the impartiality and independence of the board. Change is often invigorating, and I would be grateful to be a board member at a time when these changes are taking root. I believe my experience as an attorney representing the city, its officials, including the council and its members, and other public servants in a wide variety of matters over 34 years gives me a useful perspective to contribute to the board's discussions and deliberations. In particular, my background as Chief of Labor and Employment Law for 10 years provides a solid grounding to analyze some issues that may come before the board. The knowledge that I have accumulated working in multiple administrations with a variety of agencies and public officials and their staffs provide an understanding of city government and operations that should be beneficial to the work of the board. I am excited and humbled by the opportunity to continue to serve our city as a Conflicts of Interest board member and thank Comptroller Lander for the nomination and the council for its consideration. I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on your nomination. I also want to know we've been joined by Councilmember Borelli, Councilmember Natasha Williams, Councilmember Yeager, and of course I mentioned Councilmember Brown and Brooks Powers virtually as well. Just to do a few questions, and I'll hand it over to my colleagues. To begin here, though, your testimony notes strong institutions can be improved and notes some of the ones that have happened in the recent years, including something that could lead to your nomination, of course, here as well. Can you give us other thoughts on where you believe the board and this agency could be strengthened and how what we think we perceive a strong institution it is today, how that can be improved and what you might offer to that?
I think that the changes that were made as a result of the 2019 charter revision are going to be taking root now, and the changes to the board as well as the requirement that there be a 3-member quorum will also make changes to the board. So once I'm there, I think I will talk to the other board members and get an understanding of what they think works and doesn't work. I know that there's a requirement in Chapter 68 itself that they do a periodic, I think it's every 5 years, review of their structure and rules and make recommendations to this body for changes. So I'd like to know where we are in that 5 years and prepare for that, since if I'm appointed, it'll be a 6-year term. It'll fall in there somewhere that we get to make recommendations to this body, and I intend to do a review with the other board members and the staff to make those recommendations. But at this point, I don't really know what I would recommend.
Got it. Obviously, COIB is an agency that governs so much of our lives here as public servants and elected officials. How would you ensure fines and penalties are fair and equitable for violations of the conflict of interest laws? And do you have any recommendations for how to improve the current system?
So I think that the current system is strong. I know that the board acts by consensus. They have to have at least 3 votes to make a determination. I want to see how that works, and the lawyer in me would want to know the precedent for whatever action we are intending to take to make sure that it's consistent across the board, regardless of who the respondent is. I would want to know what has been decided in the past in this or similar situations, or if it's a completely novel situation, I would be kind of aware that we would be making a new law. So I think relying on precedent, like lawyers do, is what the approach that I will take.
Got it. And what's your position on the board's use of public and private warning letters to address alleged or purported violations of the conflicts of interest law?
I think that they could both be useful. The private warning letters, it's my understanding, were issued as a result of when the board didn't think that there was enough of evidence to prove a violation, or if it was a technical violation where it wasn't cost effective with the resources to implement that. I do know that as a result of the litigation by the New York Times, the current chair has said that they are suspending the use of private warning letters and are going to be reevaluating their use. So I'm interested in participating in that reevaluation. As to public warning letters, I think they serve a very useful purpose in that the public gets to see, and other city employees get to see, that there's enforcement going on, and what kind of penalties are issued for transgressive behavior. Public warning letters, in my mind and my understanding, are more like stipulations of settlement, so you don't go through the whole hearing process. The person is agreeing that there was a violation and is being publicly censured, essentially.
Got it. And I wanted to get to my colleagues as well, but I guess this is questions and maybe even a part of a bigger question here, which is kind of the role of the Conflict of Interest Board. Obviously, the presence of it, and the actions that are taken by that agency have a tremendous effect. Even benefit might be the word to use, to ensuring that there is a compliance with the law, that there is good behavior, and that we hold our public servants to the highest ethical standards. But how do you view the sort of balance between the enforcement side of this, which is to hold people accountable when they are breaking the law, versus a role in terms of preventative, and where do you see perhaps a change in that balance if you're on the board, or how do you view that more sort of globally, the role between doing the preventative side of it and doing the sort of punitive side of it, and other places where you think they could be doing one or the other differently?
I think that the primary goal should be preventative, that's where the balance should weigh more heavily. And I do think that the requirement that we all get training every 2 years educates all the public servants. But I am a huge fan of the Attorney of the Day service line, where you can call up and sort of provide the fact pattern and get their immediate response on whether, this is a problem, don't do it, or, yeah, you already goofed, and a referral is made forward. But I think that the advice that you would get helps to prevent some violations before they occur. So I think that's, and they're also nice. I mean, if you ever called that line, the people who answered are like the epitome of nice service call takers. That I think that expanding that role and having more people aware of it so that they're using it and avoiding violations in the future is one way to do it. I would want to talk to the staff about their ideas as to other ways to get the information out there. They have, for a short time, I was the law department's liaison to the Conflict of Interest Board, and they had like a handy one-page layperson's interpretation so that it was easier to understand what the requirements were. I think doing more of that, because nobody takes the time, or only lawyers take the time to read the actual law, but putting it in a way that people can understand and distributing that more widely may be another way. But I definitely think we should be putting more emphasis on the prevention.
Got it. And we're also joined by Councilmember Salamanca here as well, virtually. I have one more question. It's a question from Councilmember Sylvina Brooks Powers. No relation, but we do make a good Powers caucus. How do your previous roles, including as Corporation Counsel, inform your perspective as a potential board member? Can you describe how your experience prepares you to be impartial in evaluating cases?
As in all of my positions at the law department, I had to evaluate cases and the facts in front of me and make a determination on whether settlement, litigation, which path to take. And you develop an impartial eye and try to sort of see it as the reasonable person on the street is going to see it. I think that training will help me to do similar analysis and assessment of matters that come before the board. I also have an understanding of how a lot of the city agencies work, just having had them as clients. So I think that gives me a little bit of an inside track on, something that I'm being told doesn't quite sound like it's legit. I would have an ability to see that and express it to the other board members, although they have quite a bit of city experience as well.
Got it. Thank you. I'm going to now move on to questions from my colleagues. I think we have a question first from Councilmember Hudson.
Thank you, Chair Powers. Good morning, Ms. Pestana. I want to thank you for your decades of service to the city at the law department. The council was able to work productively with you and your senior staff since your confirmation hearing last July, so we appreciate that.
Thank you.
I'd like to return to a set of questions we asked you at your last confirmation hearing, because questions related to conflicts of interest and judgment are incredibly important for this position. Given the definition of associated persons in the conflicts of interest law, do you agree that you were associated with a senior counsel at the law department during your time as first assistant, acting corporation counsel, and corporation counsel?
Yes.
How were you associated with this person?
We live together and own an apartment together. I have a son.
Did you recuse yourself from any matter involving his employment in 2015 when you became first assistant corporation counsel?
I recused myself from all matters involving him from 2012 forward, when I came onto the executive staff to, last week when I left.
Okay. And did you seek counsel from COIB at that time?
In 2012, no.
Was there written documentation or anything signed by your supervisor acknowledging recusal?
No, not then. In July of last year there was, but not then.
Okay, so not in 2019 or 2021 when you became acting corporation counsel?
Correct.
Okay. Did you consult the law department ethics council on how best to effectuate your recusal?
We talked about it, and with the managing attorney, who would be the person who stepped into my shoes should anything come up regarding him.
Okay.
But we didn't do it in writing.
Okay. Did you ever supervise or make supervisory decisions regarding the employment of this associated person, including but not limited to hiring, firing, promotion, demotion, salary, or discipline?
No.
Okay. Did you ever have meetings about litigation matters he was a part of from 2013 to your recent resignation?
Meetings on cases?
Meetings
Yeah.
about litigation matters he was a part of.
Yes.
And I think you said already that when you were nominated to become corporation counsel last year in 2021, you did seek a waiver from COIB, is that correct?
I did seek a waiver from COIB, and they ultimately decided that I didn't need a waiver because of the recusal structure we had put in place. They did recommend that, or directed me to notify the mayor in writing as to the recusal, get his approval, and then give it to the managing attorney, who is the person who stepped into my shoes whenever something came up about his employment.
Okay, and so all of that did happen? You did submit the letter?
Yes.
And okay, thank you. In light of this experience with the Conflicts of Interest Board, would you have handled anything about this potential conflict differently?
I would have sought the written advice sooner.
And how will it impact your perspective as a COIB board member, if you receive the council's advice and consent?
I think I would be, I am much more thoughtful about, well, how is this going to be perceived? And I would take action more sooner.
Okay, thank you. That concludes my questions.
Thank you, Councilmember Hudson. We're now going to go to Councilmember Brewer. If others would like to ask questions, please let us know.
Thank you very much, and congratulations on your service at Corp Council. My friends there think very highly of you and appreciate your service.
Thank you.
My question is, the city employees, in addition, of course, to what is done in terms of, thus as elected officials, all of city employees also have to be part of the COIB experience. And I'm wondering if there are ways, maybe following up on the chair's questions, are there ways that you think of either preventive, public information, et cetera? Obviously, there's training, but it's once a year. I actually know that in some cases, maybe not now, but in the past, it hasn't been once a year. Are there other ways you can think that employees could get more information so that they don't make the mistakes?
I think that they have a fantastic, I'm a big fan. They have a really good training unit there that, and their Twitter account, they have these puzzlers that come out every month, so they try to be educating in an engaging way. I think we need to do more to get people to pay attention to it, as well as give more, in this day and age, I say paper, but something that they could see and hold on to and refer back to. And that's the one pager that I referred to existed and continues to exist when I was the liaison. But I do think more publicity for their services and their education. I mean, employees, public servants seem to think of them more as like enforcement, really just, and not so much preventative and an advisory role. I think we need to make that part of their business much more public and accessible.
How did you discuss and publicize at law department what COIB does? Because obviously you and others maybe would have taken more attention to it in previous time periods.
So we do have one of their trainers comes and does the training for us. I think it's every 2 years. And also we do we partner with them to do training at other city agencies that are available, because there's other laws that come into play as well. We have a person who does a lot of the COIB, work with the COIB, and she sends out a global email to the entire law department when they do their puzzler, and there's sort of the challenge of the month to try to get people's attention on that. So those are the primary ways that I can think of offhand that we used at the law department to try to get people engaged. But it's, I think it's hard for city employees who are busy doing their job to take the moment out, so we need to find something that'll catch their attention.
Yeah, I mean, I hope you would do that, because I have to say, it's not something, I see mistakes made over the years, because I have been doing this for a long time in terms of public service, And I don't think we have enough information about what is or is not the rules of the road, so to speak, in terms of city government. So I'm hoping that if you serve in that role, much more will be done. It is not, in my opinion, a first thought in terms of I should call COI before I do X. It's not the first thing that people do. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Brewer. We've also been joined virtually with Councilmember Ressler. I think now we're going to go to Councilmember Sanchez for questions.
Good morning,
Good morning.
and congratulations on your appointment.
Thank you.
So my question is with respect to number 3, where you say that you would not recuse yourself in cases that involve your former law department colleagues. And I just wanted to hear a little bit more about your thinking there. You mentioned that in the law department itself and in different units that you were in, you did not necessarily recuse yourself when there were colleagues or people that you knew involved in the cases. So how do you think about those, we're talking a lot about perception of conflict of interest as well as actual conflict of interest. So how do you think about the perception of conflict of interest in those kinds of cases?
I think it's important to have both the perception and the actual impartiality. But I also, it's a small board, 5 members, and they act by consensus. No individual member vote is going to change the outcome necessarily unless it's a close one. Just because I know someone doesn't mean that I should recuse myself. I know a lot of people, as I'm sure you all do, but I would have to look at the particular facts. Is it something that I was involved in when I was at the law department, or if it's somebody that I was particularly close to, I think that I would need to recuse myself because no matter what, the perception will be there. But if it is just someone who I occasionally interacted with, and I had no knowledge of the underlying facts, I don't think it would be necessary just because they're a law department employee or a city employee. I had clients in all the agencies, and there might be somebody that I worked with closely at an agency. I would similarly have to take a step back and say, how is this going to look? And recuse myself then. But I don't think it should be automatic. I think there's got to be some analysis as to what the relationship is and the underlying facts.
Thank you, and good to see you again.
Good to see you too.
Thank you. Do we have any other folks signed up for questions? No? Okay. Okay, well, congratulations on your nomination. Thank you for answering those questions, and seeing none, we'll move on to our next candidate. Thanks so much. So we're going to move on to our next candidate. We are first going to swear you in. If you can do a quick swearing in, and we'll have Billy, the public advocate, would like to make a brief opening, and then we'll turn to you to make an opening statement as well.
Can you please raise your right hand? Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Sorry, I apologize. I think we have Councilmember Ressler here, who I have one more question for. Ms. Pastan, I'm sorry to jump in late, and we'll come back right to you.
Hello?
Oh, I think we lost him, so we'll...
I'll be here if he comes back.
I'm sure you're really disappointed.
I haven't talked to him in a long time.
If he comes back, we'll have him up. But anyway, we'll turn back to our next candidate.
Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Great, thank you. Before we turn for your opening statement, we'll invite the public advocate, Jemani Williams, to make an opening statement here as well.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. As mentioned, my name is Jemani Williams, Public Advocate for the City of New York. I want to thank Speaker Adams, Chair Keith Powers, and the members of the committee for holding this hearing to consider the appointment of Ifeoma Ike, Attorney at Law to New York City's Conflict of Interest Board. I want to congratulate both of you on your nominations. I respectfully request that the members of this committee vote to affirm the appointment of Ms. Ike to the board. This is the first appointment ever by a public advocate to the Conflicts of Interest Board. As a result of the 2019 charter revision that granted the comptroller and the public advocate an appointment each, I believe an express reason to try to provide much needed diversity of opinion on the board. It is with pride that I nominated Ms. Ike, who has a distinguished career in government and in the private sector. She has a bachelor's degree in communications and master's in communications research and theory. Ms. Ike received her Juris Doctor from CUNY Law School and then received her LLM, Masters of Law, in Litigation and Dispute Resolution at George Washington University of Law. Ms. Mike was a counsel fellow to the Committee on the Judiciary in the United States Congress. She served as a counsel to Obama for America and worked on creating multi-state legislative reforms to stop the wrongful incarceration of individuals. Ms. Ike served as Deputy Executive Director for the New York City Young Men's Initiative at the Office of the Mayor. She was the co-founder and partner of the think tank Think Rubik's. Ms. Ike is currently a partner at Pink Cornrows and as an adjunct assistant professor at CUNY's Lehman College, teaching political science and African American studies. As an attorney, Ms. Ike knows the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. She will be forthright and resolute in her findings, having been a member of this body for either as a member and ex officio, I guess going on 12 years now, having been to many of these hearings and hearing questions on possible conflicts, which I've been involved in questioning folks, and as we've heard and probably will hear the issues for these nominations, my hope is that the board will ask the questions, hear the answers, and as we have usually done in the past, if those answers are satisfactory, move forward with approving the nominations. Once again, thank you for the opportunity to address everyone today.
Thank you. Thank you for that opening statement, and thank you for joining us here today as well, Mr. Public Advocate. We'll now go to Ms. Can I get Ike is the pronunciation? We'll go to Ms. Ike for her opening statement.
Thank you. And first, let me start by apologizing to everyone here for the lateness. And I want to thank, I think he made it back. My brother was able to drive my car to the parking garage. So that accident delayed me. So thank you all for your patience. I also want to say congratulations to the fellow nominee. So good morning, Madam Speaker Adams, council members of the Rules Committee, New York City council members, and this city that I call home. My dad and I are different in so many ways. He's a conservative who was raised in a village in Nigeria who migrated here to pursue the American dream. I'm a student of movements and a dreamer raised in the poor streets of Trenton, New Jersey, who fights every day to make sure the American dream is real for everyone. Despite our difference, it was my dad who made me love ethics. Most people know that one has to pass the bar before one becomes an attorney, but there is another exam called the MPRE, which focuses purely on legal ethics. Like most of my peers, I took the exam while I was still in law school, and when I didn't pass the first time by less than 10 points, my dad gave me some advice that frames my thoughts for today. Fall in love with ethics, not to be perfect, but to be better. Today, I'm sitting before you because in 2019, voters decided that we can improve how ethics functions in our city. As a non-mayoral nominee, I have many of the traditional qualifications of past COI board members. I'm an attorney who has experience interpreting the law, providing legal guidance, and using precedent and standing decisions to determine outcomes. But what many may not know is that being a lawyer is actually not a requirement to serve on COIB. And that is important because the relevant work experience that made me say yes to this nomination is as a former city employee, as the former Deputy Executive Director for the New York City Young Men's Initiative, which I actually advocated to be changed to the Young People's Initiative, but that's a separate conversation. If I can be honest, I had relatively little experience with COIB while serving for the city. That is not to say they weren't valuable or that there weren't resources. COIB has helpful tools, but I'm unsure if the majority of us engage with COIB outside of our mandatory onboarding process and the few mandatory trainings. And the few times I heard fellow employees discuss COIB, it was through a lens of either punitive measures or in the context of the mayor, which is why I was surprised that one of the missions of COIB was to support the professional development and education of employees within the city to better understand ethics, as my dad would say, not to be perfect, but to be better. So I come into this hearing as both a former public servant and a current CEO of a social impact and equity team, which advises and trains leaders and organizations to use data and narratives to improve environments so that equity is real for especially those who bear the brunt of unjust and unequal systems. I'm excited to engage with you all today about the ways COIB can support each city employee, better understand the rules, get support when needed, and see this as a space for both accountability and an opportunity to improve. There is a way to ensure equity is at the core of how we evaluate each decision, that each board member is independent from any influence, and that we support the hardworking COIB staff and legal team who currently are tasked with training and equipping almost 400,000 city employees. I look forward to learning more through this conversation about how that is achieved and hopefully sharing my expertise in this area as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go through a few questions first, and then I'll turn over to my colleagues to dive in as well. A couple questions just sort of on the board, and some questions I'd asked of our other nominee here as well. And I should mention congratulations on your nomination here today. Can you tell us what you do as a member of the board to ensure more equity in the application of the conflicts of interest law to non-mayoral city elected officials and employees?
Sure. I mean, even as I'm sure we'll touch on today, I would like to say that as an employee, I knew all the rules. I did not. I think that it's important that when we are engaging as COIB and as a former city employee, I come in with an experience of what it means to actually go through doing great work for the city, but also not necessarily knowing all of the rules that impact your employment and even impact when you leave city service. In general, some of the things that run through my mind when it comes to the city, the composition of our public servants in this city is that in a city that is majority people of color, that is also reflected in our the composition of those who serve for the city. That also means that women of color are also working and are also, in many ways, in spaces disproportionately where they're not in supervisory roles, in spaces of power, and every city employee that I've met that has been a part of a marginalized community wants to make sure that they don't get in trouble. I think it's important when we are looking at actions and decisions that come before us that we are, of course, looking at the rule of law, but also recognizing that context is important as to how we determine what the outcome of the consequence should be, and also that we don't just rest at the decision, but we also think about what are some of the educational implications that could support COIB as an agency, and to the extent that we would need to, if appointed, we would need to come before the city council to really discuss what are some tools that could be better either tweaked or some tools that could be enhanced so that some of these issues could be prevented. That is actually what I think is at the essence of the expansion of the 2019 charter. So that is in part what I think I would be laser focused on to make sure that equity as it relates to people of color and those who serve in the city and are trying to make this city better every day, that we do bring in the context of what did they actually know prior to getting in, and where are the opportunities that they could have learned more about ethics while they're working.
Got it. A couple more questions, and then I'll hand it over to some colleagues. Do you believe the board should have wide discretion in determining a fine, or should potential fines be laid out in an established schedule form, which the board would utilize as it's doing its decision-making on how to penalize someone for a violation?
I think this is an interesting question because there's a part of this that I know I would need to learn more about how this space works. The issue that I have with scheduled, or the concern that I would like to speak with other board members around scheduled fine determinations is whether or not blanket fines are equitably applied and treated to all city employees based on their circumstance or their situation. I do not want to put out, this is for academic purposes, I want to put that out for the record, but when I think of two individuals that may be confronting a $5,000 fine, as a board member, I am going to want to know how much do they make for the year? Is this $5,000 not only something that can impact their livelihood, but is this $5,000, this blanket $5,000, is that actually equitable depending on the context of that individual's employment, their title, their seniority, how much they knew, how long they've been in office. So there are things that I would want to know around who the individual is that has allegedly violated that I think warrants a discussion. And I think that at this stage, as someone who is not served on COIB, it would be helpful for us to know how the application of these fines are decided as it currently stands. But I do think that this is a conversation that requires more insight, more research, more testimony. At this stage, I don't think I'm in a position to say one or the other.
Okay. But would be interested in your opinion once you do make it to the board
Sure.
as well. These are questions that actually were submitted to me by Councilmember Sylvana Brooks Powers. I just wanted to ask, since she's not here to ask questions, I think she's chairing her own committee here today. One of them is in response to your pre-hearing questions, you mentioned using all tools available to create avenues to actualize equity. I think you've touched on this a little bit in your
Sure.
previous answers. Can you expand on that? How do you envision your role on the COIB as advancing equity?
So when I say all tools, I think the main thing is like there's no one for me. I think that there is I'm definitely pulling on experiences that I've had, obviously, as a former city employee, and even a former city employee that also had to manage other team members. So I think that it's really important in this space, since it's been almost 5 years, to really think and reflect back as to not only what are the ways that I could have had more tools to actually be able to do my job better, but what are the ways that I also could have supported my team members and those that look up to me to have that information? Since, as was mentioned earlier, we're all working really fast, everybody's doing their job. Trainings and set times to make it to 250 Broadway or to wherever you need to get to may not be convenient for everyone. Even the phone service, which is a great support, depending on what your title is, that you may not actually have that time to actually have that downtime to make those calls. So that's one aspect that I think would be helpful, and that's in some ways pretty obvious because I used to work here. But I also think that when it comes to the interpretation of the law, that I, in some ways, am a little bit of a nerd, if you will, about how. Are there possibly different interpretations of something that has traditionally been applied throughout the city? So, for example, I know one of the questions that you all were interested in has to do with whether or not we would need to give the mayor or any agency head a heads up, if you will, prior to a consultation, prior to actually reaching out to any individual or alleged individual that may have done wrongdoing. The first clause of that part in the charter actually says, if the board determines. And I think that's a very interesting way to start a clause, because anything that comes after that, you can interpret it the way that precedent has shown with opinions, which typically, as it's been followed, the board has given consultation to the mayor or agency heads about any violations that have occurred. But there is another way of interpreting it, which is if the board determines. So it is not actually written. There's an argument that it is not actually in the law that you have to consult with the mayor or an agency head. So I think that having a diverse way of looking at the interpretation of the law, like other bodies of collaborative spaces from appellate courts to even the Supreme Court, is actually helpful in this space. I think it's important for all of us to look at it as broadly as possible to see if our interpretations would thus impact how we would actually create not only discretion around fines or is there a violation, but then also what are the ways we can support COIB as an agency to have educational tools about what the meaning of the law is.
Got it. Thank you for that. I'm going to now go to colleagues who I think have questions. We're going to start with Councilmember Sanchez.
Good morning, Ms. Ike. How are you doing?
Good morning.
Good. Nice to meet
Well,
you.
thank you. Nice to meet you.
So I first just want to thank you for your extensive service to the city during your time working for the Young Men's Initiative and all the critical racial equity work that you've done in your impressive career, from your advocacy on the Hill on Trayvon Martin's case to working in the Bronx in Lehman College, which is very close to where I grew up. And so I want to just appreciate that. You should be commended for your dedication to service and for this important work. So I want to focus on a potential conflict of interest that you may have had in seeking a contract with the city during your time in the mayor's office on behalf of a for-profit company that you co-founded. And I view this topic as particularly important since you have been nominated for the Conflicts of Interest Board. Your judgment is going to be, as all commissioners, going to be really important. And again, as I said previously, both the perceived conflict of interest as well as actual conflict of interest. So just starting off with some questions, is it true that you worked in the office of the mayor from February 18th, 2015 through October 20th, 2017?
That is true. That is correct.
Okay, thank you. On your resume, you indicate that you became a co-founder of a for-profit company called Think Rubik's in August of 2017. Is that right?
I was co-founder, so on my, yes, that is correct. It is also important to note that while I was in the city, just a caveat on the for-profit, that we were basically a baby startup during that time. So that it is a for-profit consultancy, but as far as was profit coming in during that time, I think that's the discrepancy. I was not working on any projects during that time when Think Rubik's was in its early infancy.
Okay, so there was no income at Think Rubik's at the time?
They had projects, but I was not, I don't know if I'm explaining it correctly, but I was not working on any contracts at that time.
Got it.
Right.
Okay, that makes sense. So you became a co-founder of Think Rubik's while working for the mayor's office, though. That's true to say?
That is true.
Okay. In your responses to the pre-hearing questions, you indicated that upon leaving City Hall, I was asked if I could design a social impact strategy connecting Black communities in New York City to mental health support systems and mental health first aid training. I was unsure if I could, given the one-year rule, but was cleared because it was through a different agency. I do not remember the name of the person who cleared my ability to work on this project. That addresses what you did at the conclusion of your city service in October 2017, but did you seek a waiver from the Conflicts of Interest Board to become a co-founder of Think Rubik's from that inception, from August 2017?
For Think Rubik's, I did not.
Okay, and just to clarify, when you say that you were asked to design a social impact strategy, you're saying that Think Rubik's asked you to design that strategy?
So I'm saying that Think Rubik's was asked to design a strategy.
Okay.
And so while working at the city, as everyone knows, the prior administration, mental health was a major part of their platform. And so while working at the city, there were various aspects of how do we reach communities equitably that were well in line with what I had to do within the city. After I had already left the city, I was approached, and I really wish I could remember by who, but I was approached to support helping how do we get more Black communities and how do we get more organizations to be connected to mental health. It actually did not come, the conversation about whether, there would be a contract or not did not occur while I was working for the city. So I just wanted to mention that it was well in line with my work while I was at the city to focus on mental health issues as it relates to Black and brown communities, as is. So I don't know if that was clear in what I wrote.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so when you say, and sorry, maybe I'm just dense.
No.
But
a lot.
In terms of who asked you to create that social impact strategy, it was something that you did as part of your work in the Young Men's Initiative, or it was something that came to you through Think Rubik's?
So I ended up managing it through Think Rubik's. It came through Think Rubik's, but my team was aware that because I worked at the city, that I would have information as to what exactly it is that we're working on. So what I think is important here is that, and excuse me as I'm having thoughts because I'm in this position of what it means for COIB, right? In this position, I think that the real honest truth is at that time, we were just excited to get Black people connected to mental health services. Currently, what I'm recognizing is that while very innocent in how we do that work, it's problematic because it gives the appearance of some type of wrongdoing, or it gives an appearance of some type of ignoring the law. And I think that at that time, I was not necessarily as clear about what could or could not be done. And even within the last couple of days, which has been helpful, there's been more information that has even come from my team as to like what that contracting process was, because I was not the one that led contracting for Think Rubik's. So I'm answering questions the best that I can, but I also was not the one that was managing contracts for Think Rubik's.
Got it. That makes sense. And then just to clarify, you said that you were unsure if you could because of the one-year rule, but that you were cleared. So can you describe, because it does sound like you spoke to someone,
Yeah.
And you received guidance, to kind of keep on going. So who did you speak to? Do you remember who that was? Do you have anything in writing about that?
I don't. One of the things that I did for diligence purposes was just try to like go through my own emails, right? And the last email, the email that most city employees have with their personal email is when you're leaving, right? So I was able to trace back my last email, hey, I'm leaving. This is my personal email. I even mentioned what projects I would be working on that they were interested in, Charlottesville, a project with Lawyers Committee. So at no point in time was there any like vision of a contract that I would be working on as it related to mental health. Post working for the city, there were, and just to give a sense of what this contract, what this scope of this engagement was. The scope of the engagement was to connect Black people to mental health via what would be considered like historically Black institutions and organizations, of which I'm a member of many of these organizations. So work that I was doing afterwards was, at that time, mistake of law is not a defense, but at that time, I thought of it that if I am here operating as a member of of one of these organizations to support ensuring that our communities are getting what they need, that I was no longer acting in my capacity as a city government employee or as even somebody who is in violation of the one-year rule. I do recall, I do not know who, but I do recall just raising out of curiosity, like, am I going to be in any type of, is this going to be problematic, or am I going to be in any type of trouble for supporting with connecting organizations that I'm connected to get to know more information. And I was assured that I was not. And so I think part of the reason, and that's not in writing, I think that may have just been a conversation. What I was able to do with my former team, because I'm not at Think Rubik's anymore, was they were able to trace back their earliest emails as it related to anything as it had to do with the city. And the earliest emails for them were in 2018. So this is also where like it's frustrating, because it's clear that I was definitely in support of making sure that our communities were receiving what they needed after I left City Hall. But as far as their emails and email chains and what they've been able to trace, their earliest record is in 2018. So one of the things that I want to make sure is, especially since all of this is on the record, is to be able to provide the council with like, let me get you all those documents, because I think that would be helpful to really determine the difference between doing work that you think is good social impact work for the city versus like a contract for the city. But again, because I was not the managing partner for the team, or I was not the one doing the contracting for the team, I had to wait for that managing partner to also check their database.
Yeah.
So,
Got it.
yeah.
No, and I wanna just thank you for laying that out and clarifying that, because
Yeah.
I can totally relate to wanting to jump on something and move quickly to do something that might serve the community, but then being potentially tripping wires. So I wanna shift gears a little bit. I've been asking questions about sort of like the appearance of
Sure.
conflict of interest, and these are a little bit more fact-based questions. So. When you were a staffer in the mayor's office proper, so in that time between August 2017 and onward, when you were still in the mayor's office, were you actively trying to help them to find the DOHMH contract, to obtain the DOHMH contract?
No, there was not even a discussion about a DOHMH contract.
Okay. So I understand, and we understand from one of the co-founders at Think Rubik's that you did help to draft the proposal to the city. Is that not accurate?
I have here, and I just want to make sure, because I actually just found out. I have here actually the response from him. So I believe what he had shared, and correct me if I'm wrong, but Tristan Wilkerson, who's the managing partner, had shared that I had provided communication insight as to what it is that we would be doing for this contract. So he was the one that was facilitating the contract with the city. But when it was asked as to what would be the activities that we would be doing, I was definitely supportive of, like, these are the activities that we would be engaging in.
Okay, got it. That makes a lot of sense. And gotta ask, so did you ever have these conversations with Tristan Wilkerson? Did you ever have them at work or from your computer, work from your computer?
While working at the city? Mm-hmm. No.
Good. Did you ever work on the proposal during time when you were on the clock?
No.
Okay. Ultimately, Think Rubik's did obtain the contract for $20,000, the first contract, correct?
I believe it is for $20,000.
Okay. And your last day at City Hall was October 20th, 2017?
Correct.
And do you recall the first day of the contract? Was it November 1st, 2017?
The first day of, and this is why I would actually really want more time to submit information. The first day that is on the document that was just shared with me, actually this morning. It's my first time seeing that document. It is dated November 1st, 2017.
Okay.
That email, which Tristan also shared with me with that document, was emailed to Tristan in 2018. And that's where, as the non-contracting person, that's where I personally would like to have more time to make sure you all have that information as well. And it looks like it looks like the dates are not consistent with when the work was actually done. But Tristan did verify through his emails that the executed contract, that contract that is dated November 1st was actually not signed until June 2018.
Got it. June 2018, you said?
Correct. That's when he received an email saying that this is the contract.
Got it. Did you benefit financially from the $20,000 contract?
I did not benefit. That was not for me.
Okay. And then there were 2 later contracts that Think Rubik's was awarded, right? Each in the amount of $30,000?
In 2018, yes.
In 2018. Okay. Well, I'm going to stop there. I just want to thank you because it's really important, and as you have more information on the timeline, that would be helpful for us to understand as well. Because again, with the Conflicts of Interest Board, if this was any other board, there would be a different line of questioning and consideration. But with the Conflicts of Interest Board in particular, this is an example of the kind of thing that's going to come before you, right?
Absolutely.
So I just want to thank you for answering all these questions, and again, for your history in doing this work.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just, before I hand it over to colleagues, just had a couple of follow-up questions. The first is, this is a contract with the Department of Health, am I correct?
Yes.
Correct. And I think if I heard correctly, this was the department had reached out to the business to ask them to help assist with the services they contracted for. Is that correct? Rather versus the other way around, versus seeking out an opportunity.
Correct. That's correct.
Okay. I think I heard the answer already, but who is the individual or the folks, a team perhaps even at the Department of Health that did reached out?
So I don't, as I stated for the record, I don't remember the person, the individual person that I just don't remember at this stage because it was a conversation. But the team that we actually were working with was under mostly the team that I believe is still called the Center for Health Equity. At that time, it was under the leadership of Dr. Aletha Maybank. And so we were very, very sure to make sure that we kept our correspondence and our work with her and her team. Again, this is more embarrassing than anything because I actually thought, as a former City Hall employee, that I had enough information to make sure I wasn't working with my former agency, which was the mayor's office. So as subcontractors, we worked just with Dr. Maybank's team.
Got it. I think I'm asking, and I think just in addition to like the timing aspect of it, which is obviously important, and
Sure.
And there's the perception issue, but I think that the other side of that is how does the contract come to be, and who was sort of involved in that? And I guess my last question would be, what is the contract? It wasn't an RFP or a bid. It was a.
No, I think it's. There are like I don't want to mess up on the term, but I think they're like non-competitive contracts that are their amount range don't reach the.
It's like 20,000, it might be 40
right,
now, but it was $20,000
like
in terms of
an
the
RFP,
threshold
correct.
to before it goes. Okay, thank you. We have other questions from folks. Okay, we'll go to Councilmember Brewer. Councilor Hudson will go to Public Advocate. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your service. I thought it was interesting when you said, when you were speaking, understandably, that you had little experience with the COIB while serving with the city. So when you were in the mayor's office, did they give the kind of information that we have in terms of training with COIB or not? Maybe not. I don't know. I'm asking.
I do remember that within the first early part of our onboarding, so I think within the first 60 days, we have mandatory COIB training. I honestly share that I had not had any other type of mayor's office led, COIB training. You should do this or you should do that. I do not recall that.
Okay, so you had like maybe one training when you were there.
When I first came on.
When you first came on, okay. The question I have is, when you were even approached, or whether you did or did not have any contact regarding this company, did it occur to you maybe from the training or at any point to say, I need to check with COIB? Mm-hmm. The reason I ask is I teach at Hunter College, and the first thing I did, I don't know how many years ago, call COIB. It's like, I have to call COIB. Is that something that occurred to you or did not?
It did occur to me to inquire about, is there something wrong? Where I don't think I did the right thing was I should have been the one to go to COIB. I think I just spoke to individuals that I thought knew more information than me.
They never do.
And they were the ones that assured me that I was fine. If that's just the honest truth.
Okay, because that's where the problem is today, it seems to me,
Sure.
heavily. So I'm trying to understand, during the time period, I know there is a charter section that says no regular employee shall have an interest in a firm which such regular employee knows is engaged in publicly traded as defined by rule of the board. And the question is, because you were here in the city employee from February 2015 through October 2017, and what you're saying is that do you agree that becoming a co-founder of Think Rubik's in August of 2017, you had a business interest in the firm? Because obviously you were still, according to you, part of the city employee at that time.
Yes, I would agree that that is correct.
Okay, and so, but you're saying, according to the previous response, that you didn't make any money off of it at that point, but there was a business interest.
Correct, because in reading the full breakdown of the law, just being represented in some type of, stakeholdership of Think Rubik's, regardless of whether I financially gained anything or not, is being a part of an entity outside of my city employee.
Okay,
employment.
and that makes sense. And I think what you're also saying is you weren't paid by the company while you were a city employee.
Correct.
That's correct.
You said I was not.
Not is what
Correct,
you said
correct.
to the Councilmember Sanchez. The other question is, though, but did you help, because we do want more people of color to be part of mental health services. There's no question about that.
Right.
There are groups that do it. Obviously, maybe yours is excellent, but did you help draft the proposal for that contract during your time when you were a service of the City of New York?
No.
Okay. And do you, I think one of the challenges is that this is a position that you've been nominated for at the Conflicts of Interest Board. Mm-hmm. And so we want to make sure that nobody who is on that board has a previous conflict of interest, only because city employees are constantly being told that they have a conflict of interest, right? It's a very fine line, and I think many city employees, as we all know, are challenged by the Conflicts of Interest Board, afraid of it. As we heard earlier, we need to do more prevention, less penalizing, all of that. So that's why I think you're getting all of these questions.
Can I respond to that?
Sure,
very quickly?
please.
I actually don't have a problem with the questions, and I don't have a problem with even talking through how that would be problematic to have. I mean, I'm even admitting to you all that it's really hard, even with emails and diligence, to try to piece together things that are 4 or 5 years later. What I will push back a little bit on is that in the fullness of today's questioning, it's clear that conflict of interests do come up with even individuals who are being considered for COIB, right? So I am not the only one. Let me just put that out there. I don't know if the expansion of the 2019 charter, or even in essence, anyone who was even selected by the mayor, would need to be fully free of conflict. I think the real question, and I say that in a way of ensuring that with the majority of people that work for the city that may have not known, again, mistake of law is not a defense, but may have not known what the fullness of the laws are and how it could be implicated for them in the future. I would hate for somebody to be precluded from possibly being on COIB to help with the diversity of the decisions and to support with other forms of educational support because of things that they were not fully aware of. That actually, I think, screams to how the board moving forward could support more equity in making sure all employees have the information moving forward. So I do understand why, for me individually, these questions are coming up. I will say that I do think that part of what I hope to bring to this space is how, even through my own misjudgments and mistakes, that we can actually look at the context of the situations that do come before the COI board. I think that's also why we have such a huge discrepancy, to be honest, at times, at everyday City Hall employees and individuals that are in senior leadership. And I think that that's something that this COI board, whether I'm on it or not, is actually going to have to try to equify moving forward.
Well, we're both in agreement that there's not enough publicity, if you want to call it that, information, training, et cetera. I mean, I think we all agree with that, 100%. So the question is, so the company was started when you were, I think from what we're understanding, when you were still with the employee of the city, but what you're also stating is that the actual work didn't start until after you left in 2018. Can you just go through that again? Because I know sometimes
Sure.
It's a little confusing.
No, it was confusing to me because I actually had been waiting this weekend and wanted to do my own diligence on this. So the work that I was doing actually after I left the city, I was doing really just because I thought it was the right thing to do. It was supporting with getting specifically Black fraternities and sororities to be a part of how we share information within communities of color and Black communities. The conversation was not about how Think Rubik's was a part of doing that work. The conversation was really just about, my questioning was, am I allowed to even just support this work that I think is important work? The reason why, after speaking to Tristan, that it was important for him to go back and find the latest document that had to do with the contract was because I just wanted to see the date on it. I wanted to be able to provide you all with that date and that information. Literally this morning, just to be very frank, and part of probably the reason why I was late, this morning, when he stated that the document was sent to him in June of 2018, I don't want to make any speculation because I was not in charge of contracting, but it sounds to me that it's possible that document was backdated. And so there's a difference between when the work was actually sent, when the contract was actually sent to Think Rubik's versus when the work was indicated on the document. That's not to say that we weren't doing work. I think we were doing work, with our communities or what have you. Think Rubik's was not paid for any of that work until middle of 2018. So I think that why I'm asking for a little bit more time to get you all that proper timeline is because I'm also sifting through it as well. But I can absolutely admit that for my personal engagement, and the reason why I say my personal is because Tristan is the managing partner and he was the one dealing with the contracts. But for me, I will say that there are definitely concerns around the appearance of impropriety as it relates to actually engaging with work right after I had left City Hall, regardless of how good that work is. And in hindsight, I would have absolutely been the one to ask questions about, can I even do this work? So that's where I'm at in my fact finding, and I would like to share that information with you all once I am very clear on that timeline and provide you all also those emails and the timestamps as well.
I appreciate that. I think the real issue is the timing, which you
Sure.
agree is the issue. And question is what started before you left, what happened afterwards, the date of the contracts.
Yep.
That's what's at stake. And I guess, we're all trying to figure that out. And I appreciate that you're trying to be honest, but
I will say nothing started before. That part, I think it has been asked and answered. There was no deliberating a contract while I was working for the city. That part, that I am clear.
Okay, but just in terms of strategy for getting the concept across, were you involved with that in terms of the company while you were with the city?
I was not.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Councilmember Hudson, and then I'm going to do committee members, so Councilmember Salamanca, and then we'll go to the public comment. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Actually, can you go to Salamanca and some other folks first?
Sure, we'll go to Councilmember Salamanca next.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first I want to congratulate the nominees. And I want to apologize for not being present today. My son is sick, and I have to take him to the doctor immediately after this hearing. Ms. Ike, very quickly, during your time working with the mayor's office from February 2015 through October of 2017, did you ever work with the Department of Health on any projects?
I'm sure we did, because we were the Young Men's Initiative. So I'm sure that there were projects that we had worked on. I can't identify like specific projects, but I'm sure we did because of our agency.
Okay. And I know I'm going to jump around, and some of these questions may be repetitive. I'm just
That's
trying to
okay.
get a real understanding. During your time while you were working between 2015 and 2017, when you co-founded the Think Rubik's, did you work on that proposal that was submitted to the Department of Health?
I did not.
You did not work on that proposal that was submitted to the Department of Health?
You were asking about the Think Rubik's, the work that Think Rubik's did?
The contract that was, I guess the proposal that was submitted to the Department of Health for the original $20,000 contract that was awarded, did you work on that proposal?
I did not work on the proposal except for providing guidance on these are the type of activities that we could be engaged in, if that makes sense. So I think I had stated earlier when Councilwoman Sanchez was speaking that I did provide insight as to these are the type of activities that we could do, but I did not work on the contract and what was shared to DOHMH or to any other contracting agency.
But you provided them with guidance and information.
I did.
As a co-founder of the organization, while working at the mayor's office.
So I'm confused because there was no conversation about this work while I was working at the mayor's office. If you were talking about the contract that we worked on after I had left the mayor's office, I did provide insight on the activities that we could engage in for the mental health strategy. But there was no contract or proposal while I was working in the mayor's office.
Okay. And then my last question is just curious. While you were working with the mayor's office, who advised you not to, that it was not necessary to get guidance from the Conflict of Interest Board?
Oh, I was never advised that it was not necessary to get guidance from COIB. I was asking this person as if they understood COIB, is there anything wrong with me supporting this mental health strategy? So nobody said, don't go to COIB. Nobody said you shouldn't consult with COIB. They answered as if they understood the COIB rules and had conveyed to me that everything was okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you for answering my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Great, thank you. I think we're going to go, I think Councilor Hudson has questions for a little bit later. We'll go to the public advocate, then Councilor Williams, and I think we have Councilor Yeager as well who has questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for answering all the questions and for being here. I just wanted to clarify again because it keeps coming up. Did you do any work at all, advice, point direction, do anything dealing with this contract in question while you were employed by the mayor's office?
No.
Okay. I also want to clarify, because it's come up, the one-year ban and when the work was done. My understanding is that is not really the flag. The flag that I understand happened was the contract that came, not the timing necessarily, except the timing connected to when you were working in this office. So, I heard a few questions. I just wanted to make sure that I clarified that. I think, as was mentioned, Ms. Ike's experience is experience of many people who work and are employed, not just in the mayor's office, but probably across the city that probably don't know about COIB, don't know how to interact with COIB. That doesn't make any of it correct. But I do want to say both nominations and nominations that I've been a part of have gone through these type of questions on a regular basis, possible conflicts, things that folks could have done differently, and they get talked through and most get approved. And so I just want to make sure I point that out. I just want to clarify if there's anything that you would have done differently had this come up again today.
Oh, sure. I mean, I would have spoke to COIB. And even work that I was doing, whether you want to call it pro bono or what have you, from my understanding of even the advisory opinion, right? Like opinions that are there, that could have even been seen as behind the scenes work or work in support of existing work with the city. I do agree that I think most city employees do not have the full range of understanding, especially upon leaving the city, of what they can and cannot do. I think that would have been a great opportunity for me to ask what I can and cannot do. Most people do hear the one-year ban, and the way we hear it, for those of you that don't work in city government, the way we hear it is one-year ban with the agency that you worked for. So most people move with that sense of like, I'm not working with where I used to work, so everything is okay. I had attempts to ask questions from people that I thought knew better than me. I would not do that again. And I would make sure that I spoke to a COIB advisor and probably also keep that on as an email so that for times like this, I could actually raise it and reference it so that I would not personally be questioned. So those are some just top lines of what I would do differently.
I think, just to reiterate, you made no money off of the contract in question, and you did absolutely no work, whether advisory or others, to try to get the contract in question while you employed with the mayor's office.
That is correct. All the money that came from this project, from what Tristan shared from the records, no payment was made until 2018, middle of 2018. That goes to Think Rubik's as a company. And the reason why I mentioned that is that part of what this is about is that it is not only the appearance of impropriety, but COIB absolutely has an interest of making sure that no one is getting unjustly enriched by any of the contracts that come through the city. And if I can just be very honest here, these were not contracts of riches. If as much as I left the city because it actually just was not healthy for me anymore to work for the city of New York. But if I really wanted to benefit from the work that I was doing, I actually could have stayed at the city. I would have personally made money, and I would have had health care, and there's actually an argument to say that I would have been enriched had I stayed with the city as a city employee. So I understand the appearance of impropriety, but it is important to note that none of these checks were coming directly to me or benefiting me personally.
Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I just want to mention, with neither of these nominations, one of the things I think was also looked at when looking at this is whether there's a pattern or practice of these kind of problems and issues. I haven't heard anything on any of the questions brought up to both of the nominations about their possible conflicts of any pattern or practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Public Advocate. We are now going to have Councilman Yeager, who's walking up here right now, go to questions, and then we're going to go to Councilmember Williams and then Councilmember Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning. Just want to very briefly on the conflicts issues, and particularly in your response to Councilmember Brewer. You know, conflicts of interest, you're right. We all have those every day in all of our dealings. I'm friends with members of this council before I joined. There are actually members of the council that were clients of mine. Are there conflicts of interest? Yes. The questions that we always deal with when it comes to conflicts of interest is there are two ways to look at conflicts of interest. One is, as I just described, and the other is the letter of the law, the legal term, the phrase of art, what constitutes a conflict of interest. So, you know, as we sit here today, I don't think we have a definitive answer that the work that you did was not necessarily a conflict of interest in regards to Chapter 68. But leaving that aside, I think the foundational question is, for me, you're not able to definitively state the name of anybody who you spoke with who said this is no problem, no problem. And it's just, I would think that that's the kind of thing that would stick in your head. I spoke to, you know, John Smith or Mary Jones, and he said it's not going to be an issue. And if I'm wrong, just, you know, let me know. But as we also sit here today, I don't think we have an answer from Conflicts of Interest Board that this was not the association that rises to the level of a violation. And to be clear, violation, and in your last response, this is what you indicated, violation of conflicts of interest law is not necessarily that you got money in your pocket that was untoward. Sure. Not at all. Okay, so we were clear. Violation of conflicts of interest law can be simply the conflict existing, even if you didn't make any money on it, even if you didn't personally benefit, even if nobody associated with you, as that phrase is defined in the conflicts of interest law in Chapter 68, is violated. It's simply that there is a conflict, and that conflict is in violation of Chapter 68. That in and of itself is a violation, and as we sit here today, we don't have that answer, to my knowledge, because I don't believe that the Conflicts of Interest Board has ever told us, or you, really, which is the foundational start of when you're about to do something different, you just simply pick up the phone. And I think, I think the former Corporation Counsel in her earlier testimony brought up the attorney of the day thing. I will tell you, I've used that. I've used that as recently as 2 weeks ago, before I made a call to the intergovernmental office of a city agency about a constituent issue, that I happen to know that a member of my family has that same constituent issue. I wanted to make sure that my call to the agency wouldn't personally benefit my family member, even though I was calling about a different constituent. That's the kind of stuff that you do. So attorney of the day, the trainings that we get, yes, could there be more training? But when you reach a certain high level at City Hall, the kind of high level that you're filling out DOI disclosure reports and submitting to questions about whether or not you've properly filed your taxes, you have a higher level of knowledge of the COIB obligations in Chapter 68 than, say, the sanitation worker making 50 grand. I think that's a fact. So I think that you are being held to a higher standard. It's fair for you to take issue with it, but it's also fair that you ought to be held to a higher standard. And of course, as an officer of the court, you do have that higher standard. It's something that we expect, and I think that that's why you're getting these sorts of questions. That was not a question. That was simply a very long-winded, Brooklyn-y statement. I'm going to talk about a different set of facts, and I hope you forgive the nature of where these come along from, but just want you to understand some of my feelings on this. And speaking of conflicts of interest, we all have relationships in government, and I know some of the people that I'm about to talk about, as do you. So I'm going to ask you the following. You are quoted in the New York Daily News as saying, "Do you know how crazy it is to work for this city and then explain to your community how you can work for a man who pimps out his family to then have us vote for you?" That's your quote?
That is a quote.
Okay, and it's a fair and accurate assessment of what you said, and you may not remember it word for word, but you weren't misquoted.
I think it's a little loaded what you just said. It was a statement that I made at a rally. I do think context matters, but yes, if you're asking me if that's a quote that I stated roughly around, like.
I mean, I know it wasn't during an interview. I realized that it was you were holding a microphone or megaphone and saying it at a rally to other people. So it's not that you assumed you were going to be quoted. It's something that was maybe said off the cuff. I appreciate that.
That's correct.
Okay. Do you still believe that statement to be fair, reasonable, accurate, truthful?
I believe that that's not the way I would state that sentiment today.
Merriam-Webster defines pimp as a criminal who is associated with, usually exerts control over, and lives off the earnings of one or more prostitutes. Many members of this council know Mayor de Blasio, Ms. McCrae, and their children in different ways. We've served with them or we know them. And it's not easy to be in public service. And when you do, you subject yourself and your family to everything. The public light, which, nobody forced us to do this, but you also subject yourself and your family to unfair, inaccurate, and hurtful things being said about them. But for me, this rises to a level of an unforgivable attack. And so I want to ask you just a few things about this. Number one is, have you spoken with the mayor, Mrs. de Blasio, or either of the children after you made that comment?
I have not.
You have?
I have not.
You have not. Okay, so you haven't, in the 2 years since you made that comment, had an opportunity to call them up and say, I feel bad about what I said. I shouldn't have said that.
I don't believe I had the relationship to call them or even their phone number to do so.
Who hired you to be the director of the mayor's office of Young Men's Initiative?
I mean, technically everyone is hired under the tutelage of the mayor. I came through the former deputy mayor, Richard Bury, and the direct supervisor was William Garrett, who was at that time the executive director.
And prior to your being hired, did you interview with the mayor?
With the mayor directly?
Yeah.
I did not.
Just the deputy mayor was the highest?
Was the highest, correct.
Okay. And subsequent to your hiring, have you had an opportunity in your work on behalf of the city to interact with the mayor?
Sure.
And from that time, when you decided, I suppose, I believe at the time that the statement was made, you were actually still working for the mayor, because you were talking to staffers, colleagues of yours.
No,
No,
I was not.
You had already left?
I had already left.
Okay. Yes, I'm sorry, I apologize. You left in October of 2017.
Correct.
Right, okay, all right. After you made that statement, we already discussed this, I'm not going to beat the dead horse, but the mayor is somebody you knew personally. Yes, you didn't have that kind of relationship, but it hadn't occurred to you. I mean, you're aware that some of these comments have percolated here in the council. I know that the council staff have spoken with you about these comments and asked you if they were accurate, or at least I'm told by members of council staff that you were asked before this hearing if these are accurate. So.
Yes, I was asked during my investigation for this position about statements, things that were in the public, and so it was asked just like you had asked me. It may not be the answer that people like, but I am an honest person, so
No,
I
got a lot of. I will tell you.
Stated.
I will tell you, you got a lot of credit for acknowledging that those were your statements and not saying that you were misquoted or misstated or it wasn't you or anything like that or it was just wrong. So you got a lot of credit for that. But I.
Well, it's not about credit. I do want to state that.
It's good to be truthful.
Well, truthful, but I do want to speak a little bit to what you were alluding to or what you had raised around. Had I not thought to reach out to their family, which is also what I think is also somewhat related to it is, do I regret that statement or am I sorry for that statement? That statement, would I make that statement on a day-to-day basis? Absolutely not. Do I think the context of why the women of color especially were out there that day, do I think that matters? I do. Do I think that there have been conversations that have been raised with the former mayor about the conditions of women of color who have worked for this city and that they have gone on deaf ears? I do. And do I think that there were even attempts by me directly with the mayor to address some of the work that we call Equity NYC today? I was the person that co-drafted the Equity Executive Order for the city, and it was specifically to talk about the unfair conditions that especially Black and brown women experience while working here. And on many occasions, he had undermined that. So I absolutely agree with you, Councilman. No person who is, especially an adult professional, wants to hear those words played back to them when they know that they're not great words, that they're hurtful words. Thank you for giving the definition of pimp. There is also a different interpretation of the word pimp that has nothing to do with prostitutes. I am a Black woman that grew up in a Black neighborhood, so when we use the word pimp, it does not relate to prostitution. It actually relates to using things for your advantage.
I appreciate.
I just want to, you put for the record that definition, so it's actually important that for the definition there are multiple interpretations of the word pimp.
And I appreciate the explanation, I do very much, but at the end of the day, for me, that they're his children. They're his children. They didn't ask for this. They didn't. They're his children. I'm not trying to scold you. I promise you. I'm really not. You know, the member of the council who nominated you to this position knows me for a long time. I'm trying to be.
What would you like me for me to do, sir? I hear what you're saying.
It's not a course examination. I'm not trying to call you out on anything. But for me, as I listen to it, and I too have been called on the carpet here on this floor by my friend for tweets, things that he didn't agree with, that I found to be truthful, and that he had issues with, and we've had conversations in these pious chambers about that. So, you know, it happens, but for the place that I can't get my brain around it, and you know, yes, if it was glib, if it was done in the heat of the moment and things like that, I understand, but they're his children, and I can't, you know, a lot of us have children, and we subject them to the life of public service and what that means. And his kids have gone through a lot in the 8 years of him being mayor and been in the public eye, and they've been called a lot of stuff. And a person who worked in the administration, who worked, at the highest levels of government, you weren't a parks ranger. You were running a mayoral office, a strategic initiative, something that was created under him. And to come to the place where you could say something like that, assuming even if you did, whether you did or didn't believe it, or if you were saying it to make a point or to be hyperbolic or whatever the case may be, but it's been 2 years. And I just would have thought that in the last couple of weeks, when this question came up from the council's investigative staff, you would have said, let me just send the mayor a quick text or an email and say, I said that 2 years ago, I probably shouldn't have, and, please know I'm thinking about you and I hope you're doing okay. Something like that. It's just the fact that you just blew it off as a thing that happened 2 years ago and that it's no longer of consequence and it is what it is and let's move on.
I wouldn't say, I appreciate what you're saying, and I even acknowledge that in 2 years, I could have and I should have reached out to the mayor. I don't think it's an accurate portrayal to say I blew it off. I did have reasons for not, but I do appreciate what you're saying.
Fair enough. Let me go to, and by the way, I do want to say some of your responses earlier on, I found them to be scholarly and well thought, particularly in relation to the issue of the fines that are imposed by Conflicts of Interest Board on a low-level employee who may or may not have known that he or she took an action that constitutes a violation. And then there are some cases where the behavior is so egregious, it goes beyond the sanitation worker taking a $10 tip to move a piece of furniture into a truck, but it goes to a double dealing and things like that. So you do see a level of fines. But for the most part, one of your responses was that you've never experienced or known a city employee who has experienced a COIB investigation that resulted in a trial. And the answer is most don't. Very, very, very few rise to the level of trial. Usually it's those that there are a significant question of law, whether the COIB is actually interpreting its own rules in a proper way. But every other one of these, for the most part, without knowing the percentage, I would say greater than 95% are negotiated settlements after the employee is presented with the information of the wrongdoing, and then the staff looks at the history, stare decisis, in effect, of what the COIB had done in the past. How would you, given that the board is actually not making determinations, but simply signing off on settlements for the most part, usually done simply by the chair, how would you affect your view of a more equitable punishment? And by the way, I want to say I do agree that somebody who makes $50,000 a year, perhaps a $5,000 fine representing 10% of their income, is so excessive, far beyond the $25 parking ticket for not putting a quarter in the meter. So I think that there is a place, but I'm curious how you get to that place if you're on the board.
Yeah, I think this is a conversation that I would continue to, I would love to engage the board, city council on, because even when we think of a 95% settlement rate, I would still question if there are inequities in how people just decide that they don't want to, that they would like to resolve a situation via settlement. As of right now, I do not believe that it is mandatory, although I think a lot of people would, could consult their union council or what have you. If you don't have someone to consult with and there's a settlement, kind of akin to our civil and our criminal legal system, a lot of things plea out, right? People plea out, and that does not mean that there aren't inequities. That means that people want to settle. And when settlements are made, those settlements are also made public, from what I understand. These are the final decisions of individuals who are admitting guilt, and that is made public. So as a newer board member, I would want to engage in a conversation about, do we have any data or empirical tools, that could help us determine if there are individuals who are, first resolving the first question, do we believe that a settlement automatically means fairness? And I think that's a real question because that in itself is an equity issue. And then are there ways that we can try to figure out if even those cases where a settlement was achieved, that inequities may or may not have existed, whether from representation, whether from, tools that people may want to reveal. And that's going to be difficult because I think you would have to go back in time to kind of consult with individuals that may have had a COIB violation. But I am just raising that, like, one of the things that I think we need to do is actually have a little bit more conversation around, do settlements automatically equate equity? And if there are some ways that we can improve how individuals make a decision about what will ultimately be something public for them.
Okay, I appreciate that. I have nothing further right now, Mr. Chairman, so I'll turn it back to you. I want to thank you very much. And Ms. Pasana, I just want to say very briefly, you were here when I served in the council in the last session for your confirmation, and the issues that were mentioned today were addressed at that time. And I'm grateful that you've taken the time to address them again, but what I would reflect, and I've reflected this in the past, particularly at the last time that the council was confirming you, you've dedicated your life in service to the law department, a lifer at the law department, I guess is how someone would describe it to you. So your ascension to becoming corporation counsel was very worthy and deserved, and to the extent that these questions of conflicts have remained post-date, I will just point out that since that time there have been answers to the questions of the conflicts, and I say that that part was to you, and the rest of it is just simply to the broad public. The difference that I see between the two situations is that with respect to one nominee, there was a definitive answer that the council is able to look at, saying that ultimately there was no conflict. And yes, it could have been handled better for sure, but ultimately it was held to be no conflict, and the proper questions and clearances had been attained, whereas in another situation, it's simply not the case at this point. So we're kind of, operating in a vacuum of lack of information.
And as I mentioned, my hope is that I do at least provide the information that is outstanding so that you all can make that deliberation.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We have some members move in, but we have Councilmember Borelli, I believe, here, and then Councilmember Ressler, and then we'll keep going.
Thank you, Mr. Majority Leader, and thank you for testifying, and I apologize for the discourtesy of not appearing in person today. I just have a couple of questions about some things that you also had said, specifically about city workers. You've taken a political stance about defunding the police, and that's fine. I'm not here to argue politics with you, but there's been some statements about abolishing the police and the character of police officers. They are employees of the city and would be under your purview as a board member of COIB. Can you explain to me how you can be impartial given your past statements?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Yeah, let me start by saying that you're right. Like we don't need to debate on the stance as it relates to the history of just the criminal legal system as a whole. Yes, I'm an attorney, but I also have been critical about the field of law as well. So it's not just limited to criminal legal space. Issues that would come before COIB as the conflict of interest, there are a couple things. First of all, I would be, if appointed, I would be one of 5. And I would be looking at the same set of facts, and I would also be looking at the Chapter 68 to make a determination as to what the outcome should be for that case-by-case situation. I would not come into that space with a predisposition or a notion around who the employee is, where they work, what agency that they work for. So that is important to state, and I actually appreciate you asking that question. Because many of us could make assumptions about anyone based off of their relationship with any agency or their belief in any type of stance. But it is really important that when we are looking at these situations, that we are looking at what the alleged violation is, what the chapter is, and making a decision on the other side as it relates to specifically that part of the conflict of interest law.
On March 26, 2021, you tweeted, "Forgive me if I don't trust white people, men, or anti-black people of color in my hood over my body." Can you just explain what you meant by that and whether that would give the impression that you might be prejudicial towards white defendants or accused people who come before the board?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of that or just the whole tweet again, please?
Sure. The full tweet is, "As a first-generation, visually impaired, dark-skinned black woman from poor immigrant parents, forgive me if I don't trust white people, men, or anti-black people of color in my hood over my body. Data, lived experience, and wounds forced me to prioritize my life over your feelings."
And the date you said was March 2021?
March 26, 2021.
I would love to go back and check a couple things. First, any other tweets that were made during that day, but also if there was anything within the greater public conversation as it related to that day. Without knowing what unfortunate incident had happened in the news at that time, I would guess that was in response to some type of injustice or some type of violent act that had happened toward a person of color on that day, and that was a response of mine. But I would really want to see what was going on that day and to see if I even had any other tweets around that tweet that would help answer that question.
Sure, I get it. I tweet things that I imagine some people find offensive all the time. The difference between my job and the job that you're hoping to get is that people elect me based on my political opinions and personal opinions. The difference with COIB is that we're choosing you and voting for you based on your ability to impartially mete out justice, in this case, for people accused of violating the city's COIB law. There's a more recent tweet from February. I've been just asked by a client if it's fair to say white people are dangerous until they prove they are not. Parentheses, they are white. Can you just explain what you meant there?
Sure. The tweet that came before that was on that day, 12 HBCUs for now two days in a row had received bomb threats on their campuses. And there were no major national conversations about it. The day that tweet has been shared, and I'm also going to admit that it was not necessarily the best tweet, but I was actually with clients that were white. They happened to work with HBCUs, and when they had caught wind of the bomb threats that were happening at HBCUs, the response that I had gotten from that client was, "Oh my goodness, this is awful, this is terrible, why is nobody talking about this?" And then the host, in the midst of that conversation, she asked me, is it safe to say that you would not trust white people unless they prove to you that you could be safe? And I think in that tweet that I put out there, there was like a picture that was attached to it, because what I was actually trying to bring attention to was my uncomfortability of being asked by a white person, "Hey, do you basically see us as unsafe unless we prove to you that you're safe?" So that was really the context of that tweet. It was not in any way to imply that white people, and this actually only came to me as a result of this investigation. One of the staff here had explained their interpretation of the tweet, which was not even what I went into the tweet thinking. I went into the tweet thinking that's actually really different and in some ways really encouraging for me as a Black woman that a white person had asked me, basically, how safe do you feel around me? That's basically what she was trying to ask me. And I only put in parentheses that the client was white because I wanted folks to know that this person, I think, was exemplifying some form of allyship by letting me know that, like, I see you and I am able to understand that this is a grave situation. So that's the fuller context of it.
I actually appreciate your answer, because I had read the parentheses as that being the answer to the question and thus offensive, but
No, I get it now.
Thank you for actually clarifying. That makes more sense. One more tweet. When Betty White, who we all loved, passed away, you wrote, "This white can stay." So what about other whites?
So Betty White, her last name is White. And so that was my way. I believe that was New Year's Eve. That was just my way of like saying, this is a really cool, fair white woman. This was not to say every other white person in the world is not also on the same status as Betty White. That was in our community, we have this thing called the cookout, and we always are talking about who can be at the cookout, who cannot be at the cookout, and sometimes you identify that by saying, this person can stay. And so that was really just to say Betty White could come to the cookout, to be honest, she could stay. That was not to say that other white people could not stay.
I get it, but it certainly is a cute play on her last name. I mean, I don't know too many other people who are named White that would be then excluded by the little play on words. So you have to understand why, I might find this offensive, to use a comparison. If the late Sidney Poitier passed away and I said this black could stay, or if an Asian person, I said this Asian person could stay. I guess, let me ask you a question. If I had tweeted a picture of Sidney Poitier and said, this black could stay, would you find me fit to be on a committee that is expected to judge people impartially based on the color of their skin?
I see what you're saying. I would say in an ideal world, all of our tweets, we would all be able to enter into society where all of our words and all of our tweets could start from the position of each of us having the same experiences, the same treatment, the same judgment, and the same outcomes as it relates to how we interact in society. What I appreciate about at least the way you're asking me these questions is you're asking me these questions, I would even say with the hope that we could all move forward. And to be honest with you, I would never have to say this white could stay to signify what it means for a white person that actually sees humanity, that actually sees the injustices of our communities and has a history long, at that point, almost 100 years, of showing different ways that she proactively was advocating for civil rights and human rights, and specifically the rights of Black people. So on one hand, I do see what you're saying, that if you, and I don't want to make the assumption of your race, sir. Are you white?
I am, and I'm chubby too.
Okay. I didn't want to make an assumption about your race. So I think you posed to me a really fair question that, could you tweet something like that? I will be honest with you. I don't know if you tweeted something like that wouldn't have a response, because unfortunately the context is not just about the tweet. It would be about, are you raising that to really bring along a really complicated history of unfortunately white-black dynamics as it relates to the social construct. I will say that I did tweet that as somebody who identifies as very pro-Black, and when I say pro-Black, that does not mean to the expense of everybody else, but that does mean that I do feel like I fight for ensuring that all communities and Black communities also make sure that they're treated with equity and respect. And if we're honest with ourselves, those comments maybe are not seen in the same way as being discriminatory or exclusionary to other communities. So I think there's a larger conversation about why you tweeting that would maybe be perceived as something different. To your final question of, would you want somebody like that on the COIB board? The only thing I can say is, one of the questions that I asked the COIB staff was, has there ever been a Black woman that has served on the COIB board? I do believe that what was brought back to me was, we believe there was a Black woman, but it was a very long time ago. And all I'm saying is that, as somebody who has served in this city, and it does not mean that the other COIB members do not care about equity or equality or race or gender dynamics, I am saying that I am coming into this space as a Black, somewhat chubby woman who also is in this space, that works in this space in equity every day, and not because I'm Black, because I actually do have both empirical, legal, but also research skills that works on how do we improve the lives of communities of color and poor communities every day. That is the perspective that I come into this space. I would not want to be judged on any one action. I would not want to be judged on any one tweet. But I do appreciate the questions that Councilman Yeager, that you've raised, that many other folks have raised, because it is fair for you all to ask yourselves, can you trust that this person would be able to come in and give us a fuller vision of what employees deal with every day so we can make better decisions? So that part is up to you all. But I do come into this space with that perspective.
I appreciate your answer, and it offered a very idealistic view of a relationship between Black folks and white folks in this city. But you're also going to have to deal with people who have a less idealistic vision,
sure.
Or perhaps one that you even find offensive. I guess I have some tweets from you about Trump, and I'm not going to ask you about Trump, but just tell me and just make me feel good about it. I mean, I guess. If you had just for argument's sake, a sanitation worker who, wearing his MAGA hat, right-winger, someone that you politically find abhorrent, can you just tell us whether or not you'd be able to be non-prejudicial in determining whether they've committed some violation of COIB? And that's my final question for you.
Yeah, sure. I don't know how I would see how and this may just be how COIB operates. I would need to learn more about the engagement of how, because I think you were raising the visual appearance of how somebody would show up, how that would inform my decision. It is important. I have not, and I'm terrible at leading with my credentials. I do not talk about those things, but it is important to me that as an attorney that has a civil rights and a public interest leaning background, that I am not looking at somebody's appearance or their political beliefs as the basis of how I start my decision. I don't know if you were here for the opening statement when I spoke, but I actually grew up in a conservative home. My dad is still a conservative. I have family members that are conservative. They have their range of beliefs. They vote differently than me. We fight. It's an amazing Thanksgiving dinner. You all are invited to see how those conversations turn out. But at the end of the day, when there is a violation to anyone in my own immediate family, regardless of their beliefs, I do think we have to look at what is in violation. And as somebody who is a family member of them, I'm of course going to be looking at how can you get what you need to be protected or to be able to have an adequate defense. I would not go into an issue of a sanitation worker and look beyond the fact that they are a city employee, that there is an alleged violation towards them. And to be honest with you, I think the hardest thing would be to try to not be overly protective of city employees and to really take a step back and look at this from the letter of the law. But I will say that sometimes people do not fully understand what city employees go through. I will say that. Even as I'm getting these hard questions, I'm recognizing how much I wish I knew while I was working here, and I didn't know all of those things. So I actually come in with the empathy of perhaps more city employees are misunderstood within COIB, and so if they want to MAGA, let them MAGA away. But that has nothing to do with what are they alleged to have done, and are there ways that we can make sure that A, we can provide preventative or measures that do not result in punitive as our first response, and then are there ways that we can identify individuals that are just like that sanitation worker so that they can have the tools to not engage in this alleged behavior or the appearance of impropriety in the future. That, I think, is part of the reason why I said yes to this nomination, not for any political or personal stance. And I knew coming into this I was a very vocal person and sometimes funny person and sometimes not. But I do take fairness and equity very seriously, and I also hope that is highlighted as well.
Well, thank you very much for testifying, and I'll move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and please do not remind me of Joe Borelli's Thanksgiving if you want to remember his 2 years ago.
It was a great time. It was a great time.
Thank you to the minority leader. We're now going to go, I'm going to just run to the bathroom really quick. We're going to go to Councilmember Ressler if he's still on. He is. Okay, we're going to Councilmember Ressler, and then we'll be followed by Councilmember Natasha Williams, and then our public advocate, Williams, and then Councilmember Hudson.
Great. Thank you so much, Mr. Majority Leader. I just wanted to commend both the Controller and Public Advocate for their impressive nominations to COIB. While I haven't had the opportunity to work with Iffy, the Public Advocate's nominee, your reputation precedes you, and want to thank you for your thoughtful answers today. I have had the privilege of working closely with Georgia Pestana over a number of years, and I just wanted to say I'd be remiss to think of a more capable and qualified candidate to serve on COIB. Georgia spent her entire career just about at the law department and knows the city of New York and the workforce of the city of New York as well as just about anybody. She, if I recall correctly, prior to her tenure as Corp Counsel and as the number 2 in Corp Counsel, she also oversaw the Employment Policy Division. And, you know, I've been through many very challenging and complex many complex and challenging issues with Georgia, and she is smart, level-headed, has exceptional integrity, cares deeply about the city and the people who work for the city. You know, you have a group of people at the law department who are there administration after administration, and Georgia was one of the truly superb ones who, you know, really I felt always looked out for the best interest of New Yorkers. And so just wanted to express my strong admiration of her and her selection as a nominee to COIB. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Ressler. Just say
Thank
hi.
you.
Nice to see you.
We're now going to recognize Councilmember Natasha Williams.
Hello, and congrats to both nominees. I know these are very tough things to go through, all in all to help New Yorkers, which is the biggest thing here. We're all here because we believe in public service. So I just had a few questions, and I guess before I start my questions, I just wanted to state that I have also had very personal interactions with Iffy, and I know that she is very fair and impartial, even in our personal conversations. It's exactly what she said. It doesn't matter, red, blue, green, white, Republican, Democrat, conservative, libertarian. She brings her full self and is very outspoken within all of the spaces. And so one of the questions I had was, did you ever make any disparaging comments about the administration while you were working for the administration, for the previous mayor?
While working for the mayor?
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe so.
Okay, awesome, because I know that was brought up, and I just wanted to underscore that while you were working there, you didn't make any disparaging comments.
No.
Great. And I wanted you to also talk a little bit more in terms of the context, because I know a lot of your previous tweets were highlighted today. I just wanted to give you an opportunity, if you have not yet sort of fully kind of explained the context behind some of those tweets. I am a person where context does matter, so I wanted to understand some of the context behind the tweets that have been in question during this hearing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the hardest thing about this whole thing has not been the questions that have been raised. If I could have stayed in the city while doing the work that I was doing, I would have stayed. A lot of women of color, and especially a lot of Black women that I worked with closely, left the city for various forms of treatment that they had experienced and maybe still experiencing at the city. What often is seen as just oh, city employees have grievances, or, you know, we know that there are differences. There's something very interesting about how Black women are treated here at the city. And believe it or not, it was while I was at the mayor's office that I believe it was the comptroller at the time had put out a report about the difference in pay and in the difference in promotion and just the different experiences that Black women experience working for this city. My first inequity that I experienced at this city was I thought that I was coming in under a certain salary amount, and it still would have been kind of a cut of what I thought I was going to be receiving. But as someone who was the most degreed person on my team, and even my first hire was to another woman of color. It was not a Black woman, but another woman of color who had a disability, who also was then the second most degreed on our team. Her qualifications were constantly diminished every day because of her disability. And when I finally did advocate and get a year later the pay grade that I should have been at, I was told that I needed to thank this particular individual for ensuring that I received the salary that I should have received when I first came to the city. That term in many spaces is called microaggressions. It is easy to call something a microaggression when it's not happening to you. But when something is happening on a constant basis and sometimes at multiple times during the day, and then you are asked to come back and fully serve within the city, and there is no recourse, as much as even city council and a lot of spaces talk about equity for all, if you will, we were definitely in a space where people were advocating on various initiatives for how the data showed that we needed to reach more communities differently, and that wouldn't work. We would want to do things with specifically we would want to do things to improve the conditions within the office. And in the conversation that I had with your colleague, Councilman Yeager, I personally had been asked by the mayor of the city after he had found out I left, and his question was, I don't understand why so many highly qualified, people, why are we losing this many people from the city? And I, without hesitation, said to him, because the city is hostile towards smart Black women. And I meant that. That is not an issue that is an easy issue to state, and that is not an issue that is an easy one to tackle. But I do think that what often happens is that the person who states the issue is the one that's attacked. We do not attack the issue that's on the table. And so I appreciate you allowing me to at least give a fuller context of what is happening. I have found that even in spaces of color, people will roll their eyes or they'll diminish when we raise these issues. And so what ends up happening is that we sit in silence. And as you know, Natasha, because I lead a company that tries to address this in other companies, what we often find is that Black women are also dealing with different health disparities and different outcomes than their colleagues because they're dealing with the stress at work. So it was ultimately the stress at work that was a part of that statement. I agree with Councilman Yeager that it was not necessarily a proper statement, and I will consider actually apologizing specifically for that statement. It is also important to understand why almost 100, if not over 100, women of color signed on to a letter stating that working at City Hall was extremely hostile, and it does rise to the level that we need to talk about it.
Thank you. I appreciate your answers. And I'm actually going to get to pink cornrows in a second. But I just had a very silly, basic question. Do you believe in freedom of speech, that people should sort of be able to talk about their experiences in meaningful ways in the public?
I do believe in the freedom of speech.
Okay. Did you ask to be appointed?
I did not.
Okay, because I think it's important sometimes when we think about these appointments, and typically certain types of people get appointed to these positions, but I think it's critical that we be intentional about bringing people into these spaces that have a full scope of experiences. And I don't think people live their lives thinking that they might be appointed to something like this, and then, of course, privy to much needed scrutiny. So again, I also thank my colleagues for the questions that were raised. It's definitely in alignment. We want to make sure that we have people who are impartial. I just wanted to note that. Also, while we were all speaking, and now I'm trying to pull it up, and oh, my computer froze. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, my computer like completely froze. The joys of technology.
We still hear
Okay.
you.
Can you hear me now?
We hear you.
Okay, all right. Now I'm fully back because I couldn't hear you and my screen was frozen. Okay, so while you were speaking, I actually looked up the Merriam-Webster definition of, and I think you were articulating this, Black vernacular. I always joke, I'm currently in a PhD program. I know a lot of big words, but you know, sometimes I just like to use Black slang. It's just my thing. It's just how I like to show up as well. It's my fullness. So we know, and the definition here, African American English is the proper way they talk about it, which is a variety of American English spoken chiefly by African Americans, like other dialects of English, with their own histories of how they come to be. So we know that when we use Black vernacular or African American English, as Merriam-Webster defines it, we're bringing in our own history around certain words and language. And so I know you were attempting to put on the record your definition of the word pimp. And so I just wanted to allow you to put on the record your definition of the word pimp.
I do, and I think I said pimp out, which, as you know, in AAVE or African American vernacular also has its own definition. Pimp out does not mean anything with sexual activity. It does not mean anything to do with prostitutes. It has nothing to do with the exchange of sexual activity for money. Pimping out is used as an expression to say that you are using, it can be a range of things, but you're using as a cover, in that context, you are using as a cover something that may appeal in that context, to a community in an exchange for favor, in an exchange to be liked, in an exchange that they would be supportive. There are ways that I could have even said that phrase without saying pimp out. But if you're asking me about that term, it is at least important in the fuller context of the sentence that it did not have anything to do with the traditional definition or the traditional, I guess, Eurocentric definition of that term. Also, as you know, on the other side, when we look at words, prepositions, subject matter, objects, what have you, if I were to say I'm Nantasha, stop pimping out this can, the can itself is not the subject that I'm talking about. I think you and I understand that. I am literally talking about your actions that should be questioned. So while I do not necessarily agree with the definitions and the terms but that in the conversation between myself and Councilman Yeager, one thing that I did not consider is that there could be an interpretation that there would be harm to the mayor's wife or the mayor's children. I was not speaking about the wife and the children directly about any actions they had done. They were raised as him using them as a way to gain favor with Black communities, at least in that context. But it is important that I do acknowledge that there could be another way of interpreting that. But I do appreciate that you have at least allowed me the fullness of sharing what that statement was. Even in the heat of the moment, that statement was stated, yes, in a way that I felt like was in a room of people that understood what I was saying.
Thank you. And as I was speaking to, or as I was listening to the minority leader, and I also really appreciated his line questions. And I think something that you didn't fully speak about that I also wanted you to just talk about that might make him feel comfortable, or Councilmember Yeager feel comfortable, or whoever else that might be listening who, wants to feel, comfortable. Your work at Pink Cornrows and your work in general, and some of the things and conversations that I have been in prior to being a council member is about having these daring discussions and these courageous conversations. And so not attacking certain people, but being open and flexible to other viewpoints with the hopes that we all can come together fully as whole, as New Yorkers, as citizens of America, whatever, whatever we want to say. And so I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about the work that you have done to sort of have these conversations with different types of people to really address this issue in a meaningful and professional way. Because I think that the conversation so far has been skewed towards some of the personal things that you said, which again is fair, and we all agree it's fair for those things to come into question. But I just also wanted for you to just express a little bit more about some of the work that you've been doing professionally around a lot of these issues that have been raised.
Yeah, I mean, I understand why, especially for COIB, why the issues that have been raised as far as spending some time on getting clarity about work that had been done at the former firm that I had worked at, and also statements that I have made. I will say, for the record, it is refreshing to know that somebody, even though at this late hour, has asked me about the work I'm doing now. And that is important. I am 4 years older, 4 years further down the road, for almost 5 years from when I served at the city. And nothing has been asked to me up until this point about the work that I'm doing now and how that work is relevant to what was needed on the COI board. So I do want to acknowledge that, and I thank you for asking this question. As you know, Pink Cornrows is a team of individuals. Most of us are terminally degreed, as they would call them, that have a combination of both the professional experience and the credentials to discuss equity, to research equity, and to create solutions, from policies to social solutions to research that informs leaders in various fields. But we also come into this space, as you said, not having to code switch. In other words, we come into this space knowing that we are not excellent because of our degrees. We are excellent because we come in with both our cultural experience and the degrees and the tools that we have that usually come from the training that we have in specific fields to help improve environments and to help make sure that equity is achieved. I would like to think the reason why I was nominated for this specific body is because every day, including when I have to leave here, I am literally researching how we don't look at issues and just say all city employees. But for anybody who has dared to ask me even why I'm interested in being in this space, the first question, I think one of the first questions I asked some of the COIB staffers were, do we have a breakdown based on race and gender of who the individuals are that have received infractions in this city? Are we even aware of what that looks like? Do we care that there could be potentially the majority of the individuals that are getting punishments are individuals of color in this city? Do we have anything not stating that that's the case? I don't know if we have that information. I think that information matters. And I think that we cannot not keep saying that COIB is a space of education and not a space of punishment if the data on the other side actually proves differently. Now, I'm not saying that that is the case, but since you asked about Pink Cornrows, that is the lens that we go into. How do we create solutions? People assume that Black and brown people that have been marginalized just come into spaces based off of emotion, but even in the field of law, there is a way to look at decisions, standing decisions, and even dissents to get a sense of how communities have been treated so that we can make improvements moving forward. So even as we make educational tools moving forward, I love the hotline. I appreciate being reminded that there is a telephone hotline. I am more interested as to why more people are not using the hotline to get the information that they need. And that is an equity question. That is a question of, do we need to make sure that the hotline is reminded on a weekly basis? Do we need to make sure that people are able to go into convenient, to convenient spaces, whether it's courtyards, bathrooms, what have you, and have information about COIB? I don't know, but I think we can't just say that we have tools and then assume that everybody knows every rule in Chapter 68 of conflicts of interest. We actually have to think about how the delivery of those tools are made. And also, when it comes to abilities and disabilities and language barriers, we also have to make sure that it's communicating in a culturally relevant way so that everybody can have protection of knowing that they had access to these tools. So I appreciate you asking a little bit about the work that I do, and also how I think that could be, or how those parts could be relevant to service on the COI board.
Okay, well, I just wanted to thank you so much again for answering the questions so thoughtfully. While you are, of course, very ideological, like we all are, like we all should be, we all should imagine a world that is better and more equitable than what we see it right now. I do know that you are a very practical person, a very fair person, a very honest person, regardless of the situation or the scenario. And I know you have mentioned multiple times, upon reflection, thinking of ways you could have handled things a little bit differently, maybe tweeted some things, used other words, reached out to the attorney, on call, or all of these things that you've been discussing in this hearing. And I just want to say, we all have things that we could do better. I just want to also offer that the rules are not clear. Even when you do reach out, I've had to reach out in my very short tenure to the Conflicts of Interest Board, and I've received subjective advice. One attorney says this, another attorney says something different. And I think it just speaks to the need for us to clarify what the law is and to make sure that everyone is aware and has access to the resources. And I think from your personal experiences that you've outlined that have been interrogated today, I think that is even a greater reason for you to be a part of this body, because you have personal experience and can lend that experience with an equity lens to make this board even better. And so I just wanted to thank you again, thank the public advocate for making the nomination, and just for the record, underscore my support of your nomination. Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're actually going to go to Councilmember Hudson and then the public advocate to close us out.
Thank you. Just a couple of questions, and then I'll sort of make a bit of a statement, I guess. But my first question is there an oath, or perhaps less formally, a commitment that attorneys take in order to practice that addresses fairness and impartiality?
Yeah, I think under the ABA professional rules of conduct, as we are sworn in, there is both the explicit sections, but also the implied notion that we are all extensions of Lady Justice, if you will, that we balance both the facts as well as the consequences of those facts while we are making our decisions and our deliberations. For those of us that practice a little bit more explicitly in civil and human rights law, we are always reaching out to various documents, treatises, codes, if you will, that speak explicitly to various forms of even the Constitution, but human rights law more broadly, around how we can ensure that every human being has equitable access to what they deserve to have.
And then this was a little while ago, so bear with me.
Sure.
But as follow-up to Councilmember Salamanca's questions, either he asked or you stated, and I don't recall which it was, but I believe he may have asked if anyone in the mayor's office, this was in reference to your comment about being asking the question whether it was an issue, I believe he asked if anyone told you not to go to COIB. And you stated that nobody told you not to go to COIB, if I'm correct.
Right.
And so my question is, did anybody tell you explicitly to go to COIB?
No.
Thank you. And then lastly, following the line of logic from Minority Leader Borelli, on February 24th, myself and a number of other elected officials, not just in the council, but across the city and state representatives, along with advocates and activists, rallied outside of City Hall on the day of our last stated meeting on February 24th about the anti-LGBTQ appointees by the mayor. And it is my understanding that, especially on a day of a stated meeting, when a rally occurs, what has happened historically and what can happen is that when somebody feels a particular affinity to an issue and they happen to be walking by or hearing something about the subject of that rally, anybody can, come and say, especially a council member, this is something that I feel strongly about. I would love to make a statement or something. I went back to Minority Leader Borelli's Twitter feed on February 24th, and I saw nothing that stated any opposition or concern about the mayor's appointments of anti-LGBTQ folks. And when I say anti-LGBTQ, I want to make sure for the record, these are people who have made explicit statements about people who look like me. And so, following his line of logic, I just want to state for the record that the same way the mayor has asked 8 million New Yorkers to trust his judgment for his appointments, I would like to say that I ask my colleagues to trust the judgment of the public advocate in his recommendation for your appointment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we have, I believe, the public advocate has a final round of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Councilman Hudson, for that. I just want to make sure that I put a couple things on the record as well, as we've gone through quite some time talking about tweets, and I'm thankful that some of the context was put in place, but I want to make sure, if I'm correct, a lot of those tweets, particularly the first ones about the family of the mayor, were during Black Lives Matter protests. There was energy all over this city, this state, and this country. There was a lot of passion that was being put forth on some very significant issues that many people had been holding for some time. As my colleague, Councilman Yeager has said, he has been passionate sometimes at his tweets as well. But unlike some of those tweets, Ms. Ike has actually recognized that it could have been worded differently and has said as such. And so I'm thankful that that's on the record as well. But I think in that context, we should also continue to mention how many people were there expressing the concerns they have, and even at a later time, additional employees of the former administration were talking about the issues they had with that administration. So I want to make sure that context remains on there. And if we're all judged by the most passionate statements we make, we're going to be in problems. And so the best thing you can do is bring it up to someone. If they acknowledge that it could have been worded differently, I think we should take them for the word, at their word. I do also want to point out, I believe we have this conversation, I think this was trying to be talked about, that there is equity in how people are perceived in the world. And I do know that the people who have the highest burden are people who are trying to uplift the issues of black people, trying to uplift the issues of black women in particular. A great case in point is Joe Borelli pointing out a tweet that I had not known about, It was interesting because there was a couple of groups that were mentioned there: white, non-black, and people of color. Some white men and anti-black people of color. He only asked about white folks. He only asked whether she'd be able to be unbiased when it came to white folks, it shows me again the difficulties of people who are experiencing harm, expressing it. It usually is most tense when people are discussing the issues that black people are facing. So even as he's talking about whether she can be unbiased in COIB, when you look at the records of black women in particular, black maternal health, black people getting health care, when you look at the policing issues we've been talking about, that hasn't been what the problem was. The problem has been quite the opposite. And so I hope he joins us when we're raising the issue about where the problems actually are, while of course everyone has to be treated unbiased. I wonder if the question would have been asked if she had simply said, "I don't trust men to make decisions about my body." It really seems that when those questions are asked about black people who are feeling harm, everyone's back gets raised up and there are some different questions that are asked. So I think that's unfortunate, but I'm hoping we begin to learn that there are different experiences that people have, which means everybody can't say the same thing and have the same response because their experiences are very different. And it is important to say that. But I am happy, even in that, there's acknowledgement that things could have been said differently. I have had to acknowledge sometimes myself that things could have been said differently. Maybe one day I'm hoping my Councilman Viega will join me in some of that, saying that we can word some of these things differently as well. When it comes to the contracts, just to reiterate, it was on the record that there was no money given to the nominee, and there was no work done on procuring or the actual contract while she was in the mayor's team. There was a question about who had told her about whether it was okay to do this or not. I'm not sure if that's particularly relevant because I don't know if that would have changed the facts on the ground. I think the facts are, even with the testimony given, that in looking back on it, had the information been given, she would have and should have reached out to COIB. So I'm not sure that that question makes the most sense. And I just want to reiterate that she will be giving additional documents to the council, trying to get some of the time frame correctly. But I appreciate the time that everyone was given here. I think as we're trying to get particular voices in these spaces, the voices that we should get on are people who have spoken up about this. And people who have spoken up about these issues will inevitably have questions that should be asked. I've been in this side asking the questions, so I think these are valid questions to ask. But I think the answers are valid as well. And I think they really did get to the heart of what people were asking, and I hope that's taken into a lot of consideration for both of these nominees where issues are raised.
Great, thank you. We have 2 more questions. I'm just going to ask folks if we can keep them a little bit short and to the point, just for respect to time. We're going to do Councilmember Sanchez, Councilmember Yeager. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Ike, I just want to thank you for being a staunchly pro-Black advocate throughout your career. I wanted to address something that my colleague, Councilmember Borelli, said earlier about, how would we feel about a statement that could this Black stay at the barbecue, something along those lines. And just wanted to just acknowledge and give deep respect to racism being a term that is defined by power, right? Is defined by a history in this nation in particular of Black oppression. And it is not the same to say, can this white can stay or this Black can stay. It's not the same, right? So I wanted to just to give voice and space to that and give you a chance to talk about that difference and how racism and being pro-Black is about Black power in this country and oppression for so many years.
I mean, since we're on the record, for myself, I wanted to just highlight, this is the New York City that we're in, right? You all have all heard this, and I hope it's not seen as just rattling off, but I was prepared because the tweets that were raised, as you rightfully shared, and I'll even merge it into what the public advocate just shared. I'm not a spokesperson for all people of color. One of the things that I did not have time to do was to raise the tweets where I have actually stood up for individuals that are outside of my race, because oftentimes it is perceived that you are only only standing up for other Black people, which would be fine. But anybody who knows me knows that my human rights background means that if there's an issue as you know, I formerly taught at Lehman, so any of my students there, that whatever they're going through, I have advocated for. In this city, we know that Black women are 3 times more likely to die of pregnancy-related issues. Black babies are also 3 times more likely to die. Black men are 8 to 20 times more at risk of being incarcerated. Only 52% of our city is Black and brown. We make up 90% of our jails. Why am I saying this? We rattle these things off as statistics. We get upset when somebody is killed, when somebody is hurt, and somebody is harmed. While this is about COIB and it's about everyone that's in the city, we don't talk about the fact that this is already a majority people of color city. So it actually is important to ask ourselves, are there differences, not for the sake of making us more divisive, but are there differences in the way we interpret the law? If the law has treated us differently historically, it is possible that our communities have different interpretations of the law, even as an attorney. This is why we have a Supreme Court where every attorney has a different ideology and they're looking at the same law. So I am not saying I'm a perfect person. And for the record, I'm not even saying that you all have to make a certain decision or not. But I do think that it was very hard to be asked the question. As I tried to reflect back to Councilman Borelli, I respected where he came into his perspective as a white man, a self-identifying white man who was asking these questions. But what also has to be respected, as as the public advocate had raised, is that I am also coming into this, who I am matters as well. And I am a Black woman in this city, but I am also I am daughter of immigrants. I am a daughter of people that are poor. And so I am going to have an interpretation of city government, and that interpretation matters. To throw that out and say we should all come to the table and have an equal way of looking at things is also to throw out what it is that I had to struggle through and get through to even just be an attorney, and what it means for me now to be in a space where, yes, we are asking fair questions, but if we're going to be honest, as a person of color and even as a Black person, the way each person asks questions is also a little different. And that is not for me to accuse anyone of how they were asking questions. These are fair questions to ask, but that is to say that the higher likelihood of bias or the higher likelihood of looking or asking certain questions, we can all hide behind the rule of law and say that it's fair. But there's a reason why 90% of our jail looks that way, and we're all saying that it's fair. So all I'm saying is that I think that equity, when I think of what happened in 2019, it was to make sure that more fairness happens. And even if I'm not the person that you all nominate, I hope we don't lose sight of this conversation, because this is the public advocate's first time nominating someone. So that individual should have a lens of not only the law, but what it means for people that are extremely on the margins, what they're experiencing as city employees for the city. That matters. And I thought that was more important than talking about just Black and white.
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Councilor Yeager's not asking a question. I'll just close out, and first of all, congratulations to both of you on your nominations, and we appreciate you guys both sitting here today and taking what I'm sure was a lot of questions, and some that were expected and some unexpected. I think it certainly would be helpful to get more clarity and information, as we've discussed. And I totally recognize that there's different sort of categories and tracks here, but I think sort of on the earlier side of this committee, myself and others had questions about exactly the contract that, something that's, I think, most pertinent to the Conflict of Interest Board and your potential nomination to that and our vote on that. So would appreciate if you can follow up with that, and similarly, if we have questions, we'll be sending them over as well to Ms. Pastina. So I want to thank you both and everyone who has, we have nobody from the public signed up. Do we have anybody from the public here? They're not that interested in us, I'm sorry to tell you. But anyway, we thank everyone here who viewed and participated in this. We'll recess today's hearing, and we'll be reconvening this Thursday, March 10th, for a vote on these nominations. Thanks so much.
Thank you.